Good morning. My name is Anita Roach, Program Manager for the ICA, and I have the pleasure of introducing and moderating our next session on the NIH-funded multidisciplinary approach to the study of chronic pelvic pain, otherwise known as MAPP. Our first speaker is Dr. Chris Mullins. He is the Director of Basic Cell Biology Programs at the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases, and a project scientist for the MAPP. He will be followed by Dr. Quentin Clemens, Associate Professor of Urology and Director of the Division of Neurourology and Pelvic Reconstructive Surgery at the University of Michigan Medical Center. Dr. Clemens is a principal MAPP investigator at the University of Michigan Discovery Site and also chairs the MAPP Steering Committee. Dr. Mullins and Dr. Clemens are both members of the ICA's Medical Advisory Board. Welcome, Dr. Mullins and Dr. Clemens. We're so glad you were able to join us today.
Thank you very much. Let's see here. Great. Well, I'd like to thank the ICA very much for inviting me here today to give a very general overview of the MAPP Research Network. This will be followed by my colleague, Dr. Clemens, who will give actually a much more interesting talk, actually showing data. I'm going to go through my slides pretty quickly to try to give Dr. Clemens a little bit more time. Just as a very brief history of NIDDK research, we've had a long-term mission interest in urologic chronic pelvic pain syndromes, or UCPPS, which is really an umbrella term that we use to encompass both IC as well as chronic prostatitis. Of course, everyone in this audience is very aware that these conditions, the hallmark symptom is chronic pain in the pelvis or urogenital region with a variety of lower urinary tract symptoms and very significant morbidity for the patients over their lifetime. There have been many NIDDK funded efforts over the last 10 to 15 years and efforts conducted by the community at large, but unfortunately, they haven't really yielded effective treatment options or significant insights into UCPPS, but there have been positive findings, including the understanding that many current therapies are ineffective in clinical trials, and very importantly, for this effort, UCPPS has been shown to have associated pain-based disorders, suggesting UCPPS may have a body-wide or systemic cause, thus requiring a multi-system approach. So why has progress been so slow? Well, I'm not sure that any of us have a perfect answer to that, but when we entered into this endeavor, the NIDDK reasoned that there may have been a traditional overemphasis on the bladder and prostate as the source of these disorders, without consideration of other contributors. Patient populations, especially in trials, may have been very varied. Too few innovative and new approaches, insufficient interactions between clinical and basic researchers, and insufficient involvement of expertise from areas of science beyond traditional urology, and insufficient focus on patient-centered issues, outcomes, and values. So really, with an understanding of what's worked and what hasn't worked and some information from previous studies, we reasoned that it was time for a different approach. So as we tend to do at the NIH, we entered into an information gathering phase to develop a new strategy. This really took us through 2006 and 2007. We had numerous meetings within the NIDDK with the broad investigator community, developed a number of different concepts, engaged the advocacy groups, and from all of these planning efforts, we developed the concept of the multidisciplinary approach to the study of chronic pelvic pain, or MAPP Research Network. As we do at the NIH, we developed a funding initiative to solicit applications to form this study group in 2007. Research applications were received in 2008, and the network start date was September of 2008. The primary goals of this initial funding initiative were the same as really the MAPP network continues today: to develop a scientifically varied and highly collaborative approach to the study of UCPPS as a whole body or systemic disorder, including associations between urologic and non-urologic pain conditions, primarily chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, IBS, and vulvodynia, to address underlying disease cause, change over time, and risk using select patient groups and human study materials, and maybe most importantly, to provide a translational foundation for improved clinical trials and management. We were very lucky to have received a very robust response to our funding initiative in 2008, and from that we funded the current sites of the MAPP network, and what I have here is the general organization of the MAPP network as it exists today with our overall network chair, Dr. Clemens, as well as co-chairs for IC and CP research, Drs. Phil Hanno and Mike Ponteri, two clinical leaders in this field. We also fund a number of discovery sites that conduct the actual research in the network, a data coordinating core that handles data analysis, and a tissue and technology core which handles the biological samples collected. We also support a number of subcontracts and additional cores that support the overall scientific efforts of the network. Oversight of the MAPP network is conducted at the NIDDK by both myself and my colleague John Cusack, as well as more recently our colleague Dr. Zia Kirkali. We, in addition, have an external experts panel of outside advisors, which we meet with periodically to provide an additional level of input and oversight of the network. Now, this is simply to show that our MAPP network sites are spread very widely over the United States. And also, I'd like to quickly note that once these investigators started their work, one of the main efforts was to develop a website. So I would encourage everyone in the audience and all the patients to visit our MAPP network website. It's a portal for both patients and researchers. It's a little bit out of date, and we're beginning to update the website, but it has a lot of additional information, and most of what I'm talking about today is available on the website. So please do visit our website. As I mentioned a few moments ago, one of our major goals in the MAPP network was to develop this multidisciplinary approach, really to bring in a wide variety of clinical and research expertise beyond previous efforts. And I know this is very difficult to read, but what we have here is the majority of our faculty level investigators and their relative areas of expertise. And if you can read the list, you'll see that we have many disciplines represented beyond just traditional urology. Clinical and basic research. We have neurobiology, neuroimaging, infectious disease, psychology, genomics, proteomics, as well as a wide variety of additional expertise and experts in these comorbid syndromes such as chronic fatigue syndrome, IBS, and fibromyalgia. So I think that we've been very successful in meeting this very important goal of assembling this group. Now, once these investigators were assembled, they worked within working groups to develop the network studies. I'm not going to go into all these in detail, but these are our current MAPP or collaborative studies involving the majority of the sites. The primary study is the epidemiology phenotyping study, which is really the door by which all patients enter into the network and undergo core phenotyping. This is complemented by integrated biomarker protocols, studies of infectious etiology, particular bacteria, functional and structural studies of neurobiology, primarily the brain, the central nervous system, studies focusing more on flare. A TransMAPP protocol is in progress that's developing patient-reported outcome measures. In addition to these broad TransMAPP or collaborative protocols, we have a number of discovery site-specific studies, clinical as well as animal models, and some ancillary studies. Now, importantly, these studies use common patients and controls and biological samples, all as part of this major TransMAPP epidemiology phenotyping protocol. All of the clinical data is combined to provide layers of characterization for an individual patient or patient group. And the neuroimaging data is also integrated across the sites, which is a very novel feature of the MAPP network, and it took a long term to develop the methods for that, but it's really allowed us to collect neuroimaging data on hundreds of patients and controls and add that data together to increase the sample size. The MAPP network recruitment study flow, I've tried to outline that briefly here. Participants are recruited at discovery site clinics. They enter into this common TransMAPP epidemiology phenotyping study, the core protocol. There's an intensive baseline visit, then patients are followed for 12 months at 6 and 12-month clinic visits, as well as biweekly and bi-monthly internet-assisted data collection. Biological samples are collected at all these time points through in-clinic as well as in-home collection kits. Patients are then eligible to then be further characterized through these additional integrated TransMAPP and site-specific studies. At all these points, the clinical data is collected in a standardized manner and integrated and analyzed at our data coordinating core, which is actually at UPenn, just right down the road. The patient populations that we're primarily interested in, I've tried to note here, consists of urologic chronic pelvic pain syndrome females and males, less than and greater than 2-year symptom duration. This is just an attempt to look at more early disease and later disease. We've also recruited age and sex-matched healthy controls as well as positive controls, which are really individuals with one or more of these comorbid syndromes that we're interested in. So I'm not going to go through this in any detail. This is just an outline of what the patient actually goes through at the baseline in-clinic visit. This is to illustrate the complexity of that visit and the wide variety of urologic and non-urologic measures that are collected, as well as a wide variety of biological samples. And I should also note that we've been very, very fortunate in that we've met all of our recruitment goals for the MAPP network studies, both for male and female IC and CP patients, age and sex matched healthy controls, as well as for our positive controls. This slide is actually a little bit out of date. We're now up to, I think it's almost 1,200 patients and controls actually. So this is certainly, as I'll mention in a few minutes, due to the dedication of the patients that we've been able to meet these recruitment goals, especially some of these traditionally very hard to recruit subgroups of patients. Now, through the MAPP network, we hope to be, and we anticipate being able to layer all of the varied and complex data acquired through this variety of collaborative protocols and use this data to identify, we feel, unprecedented insights into the causes of disease, new insights into disease course and risk, identification of clinically relevant patient subgroups, develop new tools for doctors, and new ideas for future studies, importantly. Of course, the real challenge in all of this, and an issue that we're dealing with now, is how do you really layer all of this varied data, which consists of a wide variety of both patient-reported information, such as questionnaire data, as well as a wide variety of physical measurements, both neuroimaging studies of the brain, studies of molecular biomarkers, microbiome profiles, flare characteristics, on and on and on. But I'm sure that we'll be able to meet the challenge, and we've already developed new methods for doing this. Now, as has been implicated, this is not the end of the MAPP network, and certainly not all the studies that we'll be engaging in. We're currently in an expanded analysis of data from our ongoing studies and completed studies to identify new insights and to set the foundation for follow-up on efforts. This is a complex process, as you might imagine, and is taking some time. We don't have precise protocols yet that we'll continue on with. We haven't even completed many of the studies that I've already named. However, there are a lot of big ideas, big trans-MAPP ideas, as well as smaller ideas that are being discussed. A couple of trends I've just put up here, sort of big scientific areas that I do think that we'll engage in, is the development of patient-reported outcomes that will better measure patient experience and assess patient-oriented symptom impact and change, potentially for use in research studies or clinical trials. And also the network is very interested in expanded studies of UC-PPS symptom patterns. What is the basis of getting better and getting worse over time? What does it look like to get better and get worse? What are the underlying biological changes that are associated with getting better and getting worse? And what are risk factors for getting worse? And what are prognosis factors that may identify a patient who may show a particular pattern of symptoms over time? So this is also an area that we're exploring, and Quentin will probably mention some of the preliminary data suggesting that there really are patterns that can be studied. Well, very quickly, one of the major long-term goals of the network, through past studies, current studies, and through future studies, is to derive clinically relevant patient subgroups to drive treatments. The idea is that before the MAPP network, both IC and CP were widely defined and widely characterized: acute, chronic, early, men, women, with, without comorbid syndromes, BPS, BPS, PBS, and a lot of different terminology out there. Within the MAPP network, we have a very broad inclusion for patients, which really pulls in all of these different groups, and we're collectively characterizing those patients, and we hope through this layered characterization that we're able to define UCPPS subgroups, clinically relevant subgroups that are differentiated based on different pathophysiology, different symptom patterns, physical characteristics, etc. And you might envision that group A, B, C, D, E, for example, may be targeted through clinical treatments that are specific for those differences, treatments A, B, C, D, and E. I think that in time, if we're successful in this will drive the identification and testing of new treatments, as well as potentially increase the efficacy of treatments that have failed clinical trials that have consisted of potentially a very heterogeneous or different group of patients. So let me just conclude with my last slide, where I'd like to thank the Interstitial Cystitis Association and the Prostatitis Foundation, our two primary partner advocacy groups in all of this. Both representatives of the ICA and the Prostatitis Foundation regularly attend and participate in our MAPP network meetings. We have periodic meetings at the NIDDK and at the NIH with the leadership of these groups. These advocacy groups have been extremely helpful in widely promoting MAPP network funding opportunities and provide regular updates to the patients. And very importantly, they've helped us tremendously with getting the word out on recruitment and helping the network meet our very ambitious recruitment goals, and we'll certainly be relying on them in the future to continue to aid us in pulling in patients. And speaking of patients, clearly, none of this would be possible without the participation of the patients. There would be no MAPP network, there would be no basic science studies, there would be no clinical trials. Without the dedication of the patients, the MAPP network protocols are very ambitious and a bit burdensome even, but we've met all of our recruitment goals and we've had very few dropouts, full participation by all the patients, and I just can't, on behalf of the NIDDK and the MAPP, I just can't thank the patients enough for your cooperation in all of these efforts. So with that, I'll hand it over to Anita, or directly to Quentin. To talk to us a little bit about some of our data from the network.
Well, I'd like to echo Chris's comments that I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I have two initial housekeeping issues. The first is I wanted to be free to present what I felt was the most interesting and exciting information we have from the MAPP, and some of that is very much hot off the press and somewhat of a work in progress. And so when I'm presenting data, it's possible that those numbers will change a bit over time as we scrub the data and look at it more closely. And for that reason, the slides I'm presenting won't be available on the webcast, because we don't want to have something out for public consumption, if you will, and then we have an abstract later that's going to perhaps look slightly different. So I apologize to those who are listening on the webcast that you won't be able to look at my exact slides, but I'll try to explain them well verbally so you can understand what we're talking about. The second is that, as Dr. Mullins mentioned, I'm the chair of the network now, but I've only been chair for a few months, and the prior chair was Dan Claw, who is a rheumatologist and pain researcher, also at the University of Michigan. And a lot of the credit toward getting the MAPP organized and up and running goes to Dan. So Dr. Mullins mentioned that we've been recruiting now for a number of years, and we're up to over 1,000 individuals. What we did is intentionally recruiting male patients and female patients, and We were also looking for about half of those to have symptoms of shorter duration. So we intentionally oversampled the shorter duration patients because there were a lot of questions about how patients differ when they're initially having the symptoms versus later. And it turns out the men were a little harder to find, and so you can see in the UC PPS patients, that's our term to describe men or women with IC or prostatitis, we don't have quite as many men, and that's because they were harder to recruit for. Then we recruited quite a number of healthy controls, and these are individuals who really have no symptoms at all. They're not all that easy to find, actually, but we did find quite a number. And then the third were the positive controls, and that's the term for patients who carry a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome or fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome, because those are conditions that seem to be somewhat similar to IC and prostatitis and coexist with them often. And those conditions tend to occur more frequently in women, and so as you can see, we recruited more women than men in that positive control group. This gave us 3 different groups to compare. All of these have completed a baseline evaluation, which is about 2.5 hours of questions, plus an exam. Many of them have then undergone neuroimaging studies. Many have also completed a pain pressure testing protocol I will describe, and all have provided samples, urine, cheek swab, etc., for biomarker studies. That's all of those 1,000 or so patients I talked about, or individuals. Then the patients with urologic pain completed a protocol, or are completing a protocol, where every 2 weeks for a year, they complete an online questionnaire that asks them about their symptoms. And if they report a flare, then we ask them questions about what might have triggered that flare. We also have them come in at 6 months and a year for a more intensive questionnaire-based analysis as well. And so that was roughly 400 patients. And as Chris mentioned, we've had about 95% of the pain patients complete that entire protocol, and we're only missing less than 10% of the data, which is really remarkable. I was rather skeptical when we started this. So we're gonna ask them to complete questionnaires every 2 weeks for a year, and we think they'll do this. Well, they have, and it's really been a testament to the patients and how motivated they are to really try to find more answers for this condition. Now, many of our aims, as you may imagine, are related to that longitudinal data over time, how the symptoms change. And we don't have a lot of that data to present at this point because we're still doing that follow-up protocol. That will be finished in this coming December, January. And so I'll be presenting data today really related to the baseline data we get at the beginning, where all of the patients have completed that. Keep in mind, we've been working about 5 years now, but what happens with these is we get the grant, and each site has their ideas, and then we have to figure out what we're exactly going to do, trying to combine these different ideas, and there's a bit of a give and take process. Then we have to get approval from our institutional review boards and all of that. So really it takes about a year from getting funding until we actually start recruiting patients and doing the protocol. Then it takes a number of years to recruit the patients. And then towards the end, now we're at the exciting part where we have data to look at. So you may feel like, wow, it's been 5 years and we don't have much longitudinal data yet, but things take longer than you might expect. So starting with, I'm going to just describe some of the clinical data that we've looked at. And the first analysis is just comparing the men and the women. And you can see the women are a bit younger at 40, and these are a little younger than some other IC cohorts, and it's because we've recruited many women with earlier symptoms is why. As with all of these types of studies, most of the subjects are white. That may reflect more the demographics of the sites involved than it does necessarily a fact that IC is 90% in white women. I think that's still a question. The men were had a higher employment rate and perhaps a little higher income. When we look at the symptom characteristics, in men, symptom duration 7.8 years on average, women 9.1. You can see some folks have had symptoms for up to 50 years. And then we have different measures of pain. The GUPPI is the genitourinary pain index. the IC symptom index, the IC problem index, and the AOA symptom index. Fairly similar across genders, and also importantly, these numbers look similar to other publications in the literature of IC and prostatitis patients. So we feel pretty confident that the patients that we've recruited into MAPP are similar to the general patients who have IC and chronic prostatitis. One unique question we asked is, what is your most severe symptom? And as you can see, in women, the symptom tended to be most focused in the bladder area, as you'd expect. In men, about a third, that was the primary symptom, but also perineal pain, and then a variety of other symptoms that were more diffuse and scattered throughout. We worked with non-urology. So I should mention, one of the requirements of this grant was that we have a urologist or gynecologist, an expert in IC or prostatitis, paired with someone who is a non-urology pain expert. So we have psychologists, we have rheumatologists, we have anesthesiologists, we have a whole group of people, GI doctors, et cetera. And the goal was, we're kind of feeling that some of these other fields have made more progress in studying pain conditions, and maybe we can utilize some of their expertise. So part of the expertise they brought in was some of these psychosocial measures. And I should mention, this can be a touchy subject. I remember I wrote a paper once about how depression is common in IC, and a patient emailed me, kind of upset, saying, of course you'd be depressed if you had these symptoms. And, but I'll give you a story just hot off the press yesterday. There is a disorder, a psychiatric disorder called somatization disorder. And one of the sites in the MAPP is studying this. And it has to do with the presence of a variety of not even painful conditions, palpitations, other things. Apparently, if a person complains of a wide variety of these things, it meets criteria for a psychiatric disorder. Well, it turns out in the patients we're studying with IC and prostatitis, that's exceedingly rare. Now, having said that, the presence of other pain conditions is very common. We found that. And so I think a message that will be emerging is that these conditions, these pain symptoms, are a real finding associated with imaging abnormalities, associated with pain testing abnormalities, but this is not a psychiatric disorder. Okay? Now, having said that, the ability to cope with these symptoms is important in how people function. And it's been shown in many pain conditions that these types of measures are important in how patients do over time. So it makes sense to measure them. Also, it's my hope eventually that we have a minimal data set. So why measure all this stuff? Well, hopefully we identify a few that stick out saying these are much more useful than the others. So then potentially we can have a short list that we provide to clinicians saying when you have a patient who has IC or prostatitis, here's a short list of questions that really help in their management, because we're not just managing their pelvic pain, we're wanting to manage globally how they're doing. So what we found as we looked at this is these areas that are a little more bold are more severe than healthy controls. Not a big surprise. A lot of areas in quality of life, mood, personality traits, life stress, coping skills, widespread symptoms, cognitive skills. It's been shown that patients with chronic pain have a hard time doing certain cognitive activities. It doesn't mean they're less intelligent. It means that there's a problem with the pain that interferes with certain parts of the brain that are involved in cognition. So patients with UC-PPS show greater psychological difficulty, higher levels of stress, poor quality of life, poor coping, an increased report of cognitive deficits and non-neurologic pain symptoms. And women seem to have some of these worse than men. More early life adversity, catastrophizing, and widespread pain. And these were not correlated with degree of symptoms or symptom severity, which is interesting. We also looked at duration of symptoms. And what's interesting here is the men, as the symptoms are longer duration, seem to be, that's associated with worse as severity of symptoms, but not so much in women. So men greater than 2 years have worse urgency, frequency, and pain, but not so for the women. And similarly for depression and stress, and actually in women, it can be the opposite. And once you control for age here, you can see some of these, as the symptoms have been present longer, there's less stress. less depression, anxiety, and it may be that there is a coping mechanism that has kicked in place in these patients. And we arbitrarily thought, well, 2 years seems to be reasonable, that patients who have had symptoms less than 2 years may be different in some way. It turns out that's not really the case. We do see a cutoff in men at about 8 to 10 years. At the various different ways we're measuring this, that there's worse symptom severity in men once they've had symptoms a long period of time. In women, there really isn't any correlation with degree of symptoms and how long they've had them. But interestingly, the longer symptoms are present, there's a higher risk of experiencing chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia over time. So these may be a later kind of phenotype that emerges. What we're finding is that about half of the men have bladder symptoms. And keep in mind, I am sure that probably 90 to 95% of the men who were brought into the MAPP had a diagnosis of chronic prostatitis, just because that's what urologists do, right? We call a male with pelvic pain has prostatitis. Well, this is surprising. So about half of the men have bladder pain. Well, that's interesting by itself. But then as we look at it more closely, the men who have bladder pain really in many ways resemble the women with interstitial cystitis in terms of pain severity, more psychosocial symptoms, more systemic pain conditions. And so this raises the question of perhaps the bladder-specific phenotype in men is an important thing to identify, and perhaps the incidence of IC in men may be higher than what previously was thought. And so we're obviously looking at this very closely, wanting to kind of look at different ways we define bladder symptoms in men, and then we'll want to look at the longitudinal data to see if it bears out over time. But this may be an important message that comes from the MAPP, and we may end up seeing some type of a new categorization scheme for men, bladder positive versus bladder negative. We've gathered all these data and we have looked at them with our preconceived notions. An example is this bladder-specific phenotype. We thought that would be interesting. But another way is more or less let the computer sort it out. So we put all these data in a database, and then the computer tells us, well, these symptoms seem to go together. And that's a way of kind of removing our preconceived biases, determine whether there may be some certain subtypes of groups that cluster based on their symptom characteristics. And that's one thing we're looking at now. And then again, we can see if that bears out over time in those different groups. Do the symptoms differ over time? And then we can focus some biomarker studies, et cetera, on those specific areas. So biomarkers is the next area. So the first was the kind of some of the clinical data we're getting. Next, biomarkers. Biomarkers are unique substances or features, such as proteins or genes, that are found in people with specific conditions that serve to identify the presence of disease. And if we can identify a biomarker for IC or prostatitis, that can help us diagnose and predict disease, perhaps, and may lead to a better understanding of the disease, and better help us then subgroup patients, which is really a primary goal of the MAPP, subgroup patients into individual groups and then focus treatments in a certain way based on those subgroups. And there are a variety of biomarker studies going on. Here's one example where based on, I think it was an inflammatory phenotype, there are 6 markers here that are being looked at in the urine. And the purpose isn't to go into the details, but some of these have been found to be at a higher level in patients with IC or prostatitis than in controls. And that's fine. I think here's an example of one, CRP it's called. But what I'd point out is that when you look at the distribution of scores and things, you see that and these are for men, but really it looks like the majority of the difference is with these 5 individuals here. So we see a higher level of this marker in the urine in men with IC or prostatitis versus controls, but it seems to be in a subgroup. And so what we're doing that's a bit different is saying, well, what's unique about this subgroup rather than the whole population in general? And can we maybe identify perhaps this represents an inflammatory subgroup that we can then focus on and get additional data about their characteristics and about neuroimaging, et cetera, to help better understand this type of subgroup. Here's just another example of kind of discovery analysis where for this one marker, it seems to discriminate pretty well between patients with IC or prostatitis and controls. And another example here where this substance turns out to be something called KC004, and then we can start looking more closely at that. So the challenge, as Dr. Mullins says, is we want to try to correlate things. So the challenge I've posed to the group is I would like at least one hypothesis for the next phase, which coordinates biomarkers, neuroimaging, animal studies, and clinical data. So if we identify what appears to be an inflammatory subgroup of patients, meaning they have a lot of inflammation that characterizes their symptoms, and perhaps there are some neuroimaging features that also correlate, and perhaps we have an animal model of inflammatory pain that then we can, face it, there are things we can do to animals that we can't do to patients, right? So there are certain experiments that can be run on the animals to try to better understand what is going on in this group. And then, of course, we have the clinical data combined. And so that, I think, is something we're going to work for in phase 2 to identify one or two subgroups to move forward. And this is an example where we've done that briefly, just showing that with certain symptom characteristics called subgroup 2, that this one marker is higher. So we're starting to move in that direction. I don't have a lot of neat images for the neuroimaging. Suffice it to say that there are abnormalities seen, that many of these abnormalities are similar to those seen for other pain conditions, but some of them seem to be unique. But I think it's important to understand that this is a potential objective marker for pain, that we can say patients who have IC and prostatitis clearly do have pain. They tell us they have pain, but also we have neuroimaging evidence of that that makes them to some degree similar to many other types of pain patients. And I think that that's an important message to put out there. But I think the next step is to then, why is that and what can we do to use that information to help? So we're doing experimental pain testing, which sounds terrible, but it's really not. This is done with 2 computers and then this device in the middle. The thumb goes in the device, and then this pushes down on the thumb. And then we do at different intensities, and the patient measures, tells how much it hurts. And this pin is there so that if it gets to be too bad, they can pull the pin and it'll turn off, but that never happens. And this generates a curve like this. I mean, you can see for a given pressure, here's the magnitude of discomfort, and this is in a control patient. You can see the curve tends to shift in certain patients with chronic pain. This is a fibromyalgia patient here. And we can generate curves like this for our patients. Here's a healthy control, and you have different measures you can get. And then here's a pain patient. And I have actually, we could put up the PDF and run through that to show the group. So just hit the down button and run through them. It should give us about 100 different curves to look at in about 10 seconds. And just hold it down and it should just scroll through. So you can see this is raw data from individual patients, and you can see how we have some with a curve way off to the right and then others more to the left, indicating a greater degree of pain sensitivity. And so as a researcher, this gets me excited because there's a broad range of values. The question is, why are some folks all the way on the right, others all the way on the left? What's unique about those 2 different groups? And how can we then correlate that with their symptoms and, more importantly, maybe certain unique types of treatments? We can go back to my slides. So this is just numbers. I think it looks better here on this graph, which basically is a graph of those values. This is healthy controls, and you can see for the patients who have fibromyalgia and other conditions that the curve is shifted to the left, and it's really the same curve for our urologic pain patients. So, the fact is, that IC and prostatitis are associated with generalized sensory sensitivity. That's a fact. That's something that we have proven in the MAPP. It's something we suspected because it's been found in many other pain conditions. But again, it's another more objective evidence that there is something with pain processing that is out of whack. that could be contributing and probably is contributing to the symptoms. It's not present in every patient, but it's another thing for us to look at. And that the more sensitive people are to that testing, the worse their pain tends to be. The last aspect that I'll mention is flares. So, as I mentioned, we're doing a flare protocol where, as the patients are followed for the year, they tell us when they're having flares, and then we're trying to sort out what may have triggered that. And there's some biomarker tests we're doing where patients mail urine specimen in while they're having a flare to compare with the baseline, et cetera. But as we were thinking about it, we said, well, we designed this protocol, but we've never really talked with patients much about what does a flare mean to them. Is our understanding of a flare the same as them? And so what we've done is done some focus groups in a formal fashion and analyzed the data. And what we found is that flares are really, really common. 95% of all of our MAPP subjects had flares in the past year, and that the duration varies considerably. Some folks, have flares of minutes in duration. Others report months or years, which is interesting. And I don't think many of us thought that flares of a few minutes wasn't quite what we had in mind, but many of the patients, that's what they perceive. And then what's the impact? Well, we have immediate impact, avoiding foods, activities, clothing, canceling social plans, disruption of work, regardless of whether it's a shorter or longer flare, difficulty focusing, can't walk or move, have to go to the ER. And then longer term, changing habits, smaller social network, avoiding making long-term plans, the sexual impact, career advancement, anxiety, depression, et cetera. So in the future, can we, if we're able to reduce duration and the frequency and severity of flares, how does that have the overall impact on the patients? Can we reduce the immediate and long-term impact? And how can we maybe affect the frequency of flares? It was somewhat reassuring that at least the way we are investigating flares seems to make sense given this additional data. It would have been kind of bad if we all of a sudden found that there were some major components of flares that we were just totally missing out on. So I think that the data we'll be getting from the flare group will be valid, which is reassuring, but this this project with flares did create some additional research ideas for us. So in summary, right now, what I would say the important MAPP findings are that male IC may be more common than previously thought, and that men with IC resemble women with IC in many ways. And men and women with IC and prostatitis demonstrate systemic pain sensitivity, and they demonstrate neuroimaging abnormalities, which will help us hopefully better understand why these symptoms occur. And flares are common and vary in duration and impact. And I think we'll have much more data in the future as we are looking at the more longitudinal data, which will not just be at a year, but in phase 2, as you may expect, we're wanting to follow patients for a longer period of time. This is a chronic problem, unfortunately, and it's interesting to look at things out at a year, but I think more clinically relevant will be what happens over a course of 5 years or longer. And so that is what likely we're going to propose in phase 2 along with some other things. Exactly what we do in phase 2 will depend a bit on what we understand from the phase 1 data, and which we're analyzing now. So I won't be able to give you a lot of specifics about what we're doing in phase 2 yet until we have a better idea of what we found in phase 1 and what kind of seem to be the most exciting emerging things from that to specifically inform phase 2. So with that, I think we'll take some questions.
Yes. We have some questions from pre-registration. Will MAPP2 be needing more participants for the studies?
The simple answer is, of course, yes. The primary focus of the MAPP network will continue to be clinical research efforts, meaning research that involves looking at patients and touching patients and having patients in the office and gathering data from patients. We anticipate that the design of the studies in the second phase might be more focused on particular subgroups that the data might indicate that we develop hypotheses for studying these specific subgroups. So the numbers potentially might be a little smaller, but recruitment actually might be a little bit more difficult because of the specific types of patients that we want to further characterize as potentially clinically relevant subgroups. So,
I agree. I think, as Chris said, one could envision, let's say we're studying biomarker, a certain biomarker group, we may want to screen individual patients based on the presence or absence of a biomarker, maybe in the urine, and then utilize that to kind of oversample that subgroup. And that, I think, is probably how we're moving. Having said that, I think the cohort, the group of patients we've already assembled are going to be valuable. And one of the things we're doing now is reaching out to them, asking them to continue participating and continue filling out the questionnaire data. And exactly how long is unclear, but I think it's likely going to be for the duration of phase 2. So we're probably going to have a second group, which is the continued MAPP cohort that we're following longer. And in addition to that, we'll have new patients that we are recruiting for more specific studies based on characteristics as yet to be determined.
Okay. So how important is it for patients to have a multidisciplinary group of healthcare providers for their treatment of IC?
I'll take that because it's a softball question. It's extremely important. I think, we just had a talk from, a physical therapist. I think that's, really a cornerstone of the management of IC. But I do not myself, and most urologists don't have expertise in many of the coexisting conditions that often we see with interstitial cystitis. And, studies that we've done have shown that these other conditions have as much of an impact on many patients as the IC. So in other words, if we could completely get rid of the IC symptoms, the patients are not going to be well. They have many other things that are kind of part, in many patients, part of the IC disease complex, whatever you want to call it. And so helping with those is one aspect. The other is even treating the IC symptoms. Many times urologists don't have all the expertise, whether it's physical therapy or other things. So I think that's going to be a major message of the MAPP, and it's already a message that I think is out there, just needs to be publicized better, that this is not just a urologic problem, if you will, but it really takes a group of caregivers outside of urology as well to get the optimal outcomes.
Okay. One more question.
Yes, the location of those sites and contact information for those sites is available, and we hope that through the website, that'll be another vehicle for patient recruitment, that patients who are interested in, for example, joining a MAPP network study can look at where our geographical locations are, and if they live in an area that's amenable to visiting that particular site, they can make a contact. It's usually a research coordinator, a nurse. The contact information is listed.
And we also have that information listed on the ICA's website, so you can get to the MAPP website from our website. And will you all join me in thanking Dr. Mullins and Dr. Clemens for joining us today?